All right, so today the lecture we're going to have is about realism and how it affected specifically literature, but we'll talk a little bit how it touched on the other arts too, but mostly in how it affected literature and what we were going to be reading. So let me kind of get us going here. Let me get past this here. Sorry. Yeah, I knew I messed that up. So many possibilities. So, looking at, we have a painting here from the Realism period. So, moving forward from folklore, so it's kind of a big jump. Realism began in Britain and France specifically, where industrial and political revolutions had recently taken place. Because remember, folklore kind of over banded from those multiple periods because we had timelines kind of crisscrossing over some particular eras and structures. So this is Goya's painting. Goya's painting captures Spanish resistance to Napoleon because remember we had talked about Napoleon pushing across half the planet at the time, who under the initial guise of aiding Spain, which is how he presented himself, instead occupied Spain, which was in 1808. This led to the 2nd of May uprising, which was a rebellion by the people of Madrid and ended up in the execution of Spaniards by the French a day later, which is what is being depicted in the painting here. The painting is poignant in its realism and focus on an execution rather than the valor and the victory of war. So if you think about a lot of art that was done before this, usually when you saw any kind of paintings portraying battles and war, it was usually portraying the heroes and the valor and all that type of pieces of war. Always the positive, if you can think of it that way, because the people that had gone through it were already very aware of the negatives. So usually when they looked back on it, they chose to think of what came out of it and the people that represented it. So realism was very different because people had a lot more negative kind of backlash from it, and there wasn't a bouncing back as much as some of the previous time periods, and we'll see this going forward as well. So realism brought a different view into art than we had seen previously. So we don't see a lot of valor here. We see what would be murder, right? On this part, where they're just taking the peasants and killing them, which is a lot different, right? So this painting is called The 3rd of May. It was painted in 1814 by Francisco de Goya. So this is a very different look and very brutal and in its realism, which that was not the case before, right? Everything was very kind of, especially painting wise and in literature, everything was kind of sugar coated, maybe I'll say. Not always positively, but even when they went negative, it was sort of fluty around the edges, as a lot of you had said about some of the language, even. All right, so talking about the literary aims, right? Realist writers wanted to write fiction that reveals, so we're talking about the writing now. They wanted to reveal truth about the world, all right, which is usually all literary aims, but they wanted to reveal truth about the world, to observe social life unsentimentally, okay? So that becomes a huge thing about realism. Truth without sentiment, which is very different, right, than the romantics, right? Very different than the romantics. So truth without sentiment, revealing this truth about the world, observing social life, so kind of still that sort of observation this whole sort of from the outside, looking from the outside, which is also very different from the romantics, right? Everything was with feeling and emotion. Everything was from an I perspective for the most part. Everything was with feeling and emotion. And here you have the realists, very subdued, and I don't want to use the word coldly, but maybe scientifically or with great measure, viewing something as outsiders often. Even if they were in it, they still sort of viewed it from a third person perspective, viewed it from the outside looking in as an observation, trying to find these truths without sentiment. They tried to convey it objectively, focusing on new subject matter that related to the rise of democracy, looking at the middle class, right? Middle class and working class issues, which, not saying that that was brand new, but this sort of real focusing in on that was on the rise already, but they did that even more so, right? The romantics, not so much, right? That wasn't so much a case, but sometimes, right? That's more like the revolutionary writers, right? Where they were more looking at more middle class, working class issues, not so much the romantics. So the realists sort of take up where the revolutionary writers leave off and really focus in on this. But without all that sentimentality in it, without all that emotion in it, right? So that's a big difference right there. So so we have like a city. They routinely chose the city over the countryside, provided detailed descriptions of squalid surroundings. So that's very different, right? I mean, we've seen that already, where that city versus countryside, yes, but the detailed description of squalid surroundings, not so much, right? Because often, especially with the romantics and even Enlightenment period, we saw more of a leaving off of that, except in the satirist, right? The satirists would often kind of go there, so to speak, which we saw with Modest Proposal, where they were more likely to get into more description of what people didn't necessarily want to see, but they did it with such embellished language that you didn't always realize exactly what it was you were reading on the outside, right? It usually took somebody that was well read and would take the time to pick through what you were reading to really get at what they were describing, because they were very descriptive, but it was very ornate language. So we get to the realists, and that ornate language is set aside, all right? We don't have that very over the top, heavily embellished, ornate language. It's gone. They've scraped it off the top. Gone. The frosting is gone, okay? We have nothing but the cake. The frosting is gone. So they still want to use this very, very descriptive language, but without the embellishments, so that you know exactly what it is they're describing, and they are willing to describe rough terrain, rough beginnings, squalid surroundings, and talk about the things that people don't want to see. So that is a big change. It's brutal. The move over to some of the realist writing can be brutal. Some of it is not quite so jump in brutal, but some of it can be very very brutal in stark in its reading. Religion, symbolism, allegory, all that stuff you learn when you're reading like in 102 and stuff like that, very absent from this. Not saying that it's not there at all. Sometimes it's buried there. Sometimes it's there and they didn't mean for it to be there, but they can't help it because they're still writers, and it just finds its way in there. But it's not purposely embedded in there. It's not heavily embedded in there. So all of that like big symbolic meaning, all of that allegorical comparison that we see in earlier writing is gone. They strip it out. They're strip mining out, because that's all ornate language. That's all metaphorical, ornate language. It's gone. They've taken it out. So when they're describing, something writhing on the ground, dying of starvation, they're not trying to make some metaphor about it. That's what they're talking about. So they've taken that out. So they want to focus on the sensory experience and observable world. So they will be descriptive in their sensory description, but not for the sake of an emotional event like the Romantics, right? The Romantics were very sensory in their description, right? Smell and taste and all that kind of thing. But they did that for a sense of their own personal revelation and their own personal sense of being there, and emotion and feeling and passion, right? Realists don't do that. It's not for themselves and their own connection with the world and their own passions and emotions. They don't have that in there. That's not their purpose. This is to connect the reader to what is happening in front of them, what they are writing about. They want them to experience what it is they're describing. So that is a very different aim. Okay, these are two very different aims. They want the reader to experience that observable world that they're describing. So this idea of beauty, right? So previous ideas of beauty that have been written about were kind of typical, right? More typical ideas of beauty. More like modern day ideas of beauty, right? She walks in beauty like the night, that kind of thing. And this in light, the beautiful starry light from the night sky on the lake and all this sort of thing. This idea in realist idea, transforming this idea of beauty, transformed as beauty as ugliness, and the hideous were recognized as appropriate subjects for artwork. Where before, you wouldn't create a work of art out of something that was not considered quote unquote beautiful by the masses, simply because, for one thing, they thought it wouldn't sell, which, that's always a thing. And so they stayed away from those taboo subjects and those taboo works of art. So they weren't going to find something that they didn't consider to be beautiful to the masses as their subject. But realists do, right? They will find something that maybe is not considered beautiful and to be their subject. So this painting that's up here is called The Stonebreakers by Gustave Courbet, a realist painter. Working class people and their lifestyle pulls it into the limelight, which was a break from previous modes of painting where it was more idyllic, right? Previous modes of painting were more idyllic or perhaps mythical, like when we were doing the folklore, or religious groups, or maybe aristocratic or political movements were featured, stuff like that. Now it's people out there sweating, they're in their work clothes, they're dirty, they're dusty, they're doing manual labor, they're breaking rocks. All right, so that wouldn't be considered beautiful, lovely, stuff like that. But it's the truth. It's how they saw the truth. Truth without sentiment. All right, this is what's real to them. All right. So some more of the elements specifically. Talking about ordinary language for writers wanting to capture, right, the whole social world in an objective style, they would need to use ordinary language, right? So we can't go back to thinking about the rape of the lock, right? Where even though the topic was ordinary, right? A girl waking up in the morning and fixing her hair, putting on her makeup and going out and playing cards. That's what the whole thing is about, right? Little flirtation, the guy getting a little bit ticked off and snipping a curl out of her hair. That's all the entire story is about, right? Which we could have put that into one paragraph, maybe a couple of paragraphs. But it takes pages and pages and pages and pages and pages for us to read through it in Rape with a Lock because of the extremely ornate style of writing and language and the decorum that's used in that time period, which was part of the point, right? Because he's making fun of it. It was satire. But the realists are like, nope, none of that. We're going to use ordinary language because how can you explain a scenario of a working class family and use all this language that a working class family would never use? So they don't. They use ordinary language, right? So to capture that feeling of where they're at, they're going to use ordinary language. They're often using omniscient or third person narrator. Not always, but most of the time. And usually what I assign with this is a story that's actually in first person, but even though it's in first person, the first person narrator is not really part of the story. He's still an observer in the story, not a character in the story. He's more observing what's happening. They don't affect him personally. So even though it's not in third person, he still has that observer style, right? Most of his work is in third person. So the use of that third person narrator provides a perfect impersonal perspective. So that helps them with this kind of standing back, right? Third person keeps that impersonal feel to it, especially when you take away that I feeling. Other writers did opt, like I said, for that first person narrator, but they're guided only by their own senses and experience. So it just sort of depends on how the writer decides to do it. But you still get that feeling of them stepping off to the side. Like we already said, the unvarnished truth telling, right? So elements of character, so I'll kind of get there in a second. Oh, I skipped a thing. Issues with plot, scenarios, and endings. So here was a big problem with realism writing. And it's some things that some people actually really like about realism writing, and it's something that some people don't like about realism writing. I've read a lot of realism writing. It is not my favorite type, and it is because of some of this piece right here. But it may be what is very attractive to other people, and part of it is because it's what makes it feel very realistic. Issues with plot, scenarios, and endings. So they ran into these challenges, right? Elements of character, plots raised challenges, and opportunities as writers tried to stay clear of sensational events and neat endings, right? Because if they felt that if they did that too much, where everything was in a nice and neat little package, right? Like it all went along smoothly in the story, that you ended up compromising the idea of unvarnished truth telling. The interesting thing is it's still all fiction. So even though it's fiction, it's all fiction. That's what we're talking about is fiction here. They felt that if they made the plots too neat or the endings too well seamed into the story, that it wouldn't have that feeling of unvarnished truth telling. So they decided not to do it that way. Unfortunately, what happens when you don't write your stories that way is you end up with kind of jagged stories. As you can imagine, when you're reading some of those stories, either the stories themselves feel kind of a little janky, right? They're a little jagged as you're going along, or they feel sort of disconnected, or at the end you feel unsatisfied, like what happened and what's going on, and I don't understand what that was about exactly. That happens a lot when you're reading realist writing, and their feelings were, well, that's how life is. Life is not nice and neat. Life does not have all these very specific, predestined events that help seam together your whole life with these nice and neat wrapped up endings that bring it all about. Life is messy. So the stories sometimes are messy. It depends on who the writer is. Some of them are better at sewing these together than others, because they're more about the purpose of having pulled in together these ethical dilemmas. It's less about the story's structure, if you will, and more about bringing up these ethical dilemmas and questions for the reader. All right. So the dramatic interest in these types of stories lay in having the character make a difficult choice or be faced with an ethical dilemma. So that's usually what realist writing looks at. They have a difficult choice to make, or they're faced with an ethical dilemma. Sometimes they make it within the story, or sometimes it's left undone in the story at the end. But either way, the reader is the one left with the questions or left with the impact of the decision. And it's left for the reader to kind of think about that, right? Because it's more about you as the reader to have the responsibility of trying to understand that. And what does that mean for you as the reader? All right. So it's a different kind of storytelling and a different kind of thought-provoking process how the realist writers work. So it's kind of like, can individuals have an impact on an unjust social system or an unjust social relationships? What responsibility does a person have towards others in the city or the nature or the nation or his own family? So these types of questions and dilemmas get threaded into the realism era stories and are there for the reader to kind of ponder on. Is this right? Is this wrong? Should they have done something different? Should somebody have stepped in and done something? Or should everyone have just left it as is? So those ethical dilemmas are there for the reader and for the reader to think about their own moral compass, so to speak. All right. So that makes it a little bit different than folklore's purpose, right? A little bit different than Enlightenment writing. So it has a little bit different way of going about it, I guess I should say. So Dostoevsky, which is one of the stories that I usually assign during this time period, with the Christmas tree and the wedding, just a teeny bit of background on him. He has his own issues. He says, they call me a psychologist, but it's not true. I'm merely a realist in a higher sense. That is to say, I describe all depths of the human soul. So he was an observer, right? He was a people watcher. He was an observer of people and how they acted and how they interacted and how they reacted. He was well brought up in the Russian Orthodox Church, but he was later exiled. He was Russian. I think I wrote that. Yeah, 1821 in Moscow. He was given the death sentence and exiled, but then he wasn't killed through the death sentence because they exiled him literally to Siberia. And he had a lot of problems, not just gambling. He had a lot of other problems. He suffered a lot of issues, and he did have a lot of medical issues, including epilepsy. And it all comes into his writing. A lot of his issues and family issues and issues with his country and being exiled and all this kind of thing. You see his feelings of how he felt about his country abandoning him and all this sort of thing comes out in his writing, and what he feels is right and wrong in humanity and all this kind of thing comes out in his writing. And he is a big name in the realist writing for sure. So it's just a little glimpse. It's like he normally writes there. He has some short stories, a lot of short stories, but he's normally known for his gigantic tomes, which I did not assign to you because you would come and find me. So the Christmas Tree and the Wedding is probably one of the shortest of his stories, and has its own impact for sure. Okay, so let's briefly have a discussion of Darwinism and naturalism. So this was an offshoot here that came from realism, all right? Naturalism and it was an offshoot from realism. So it turned to Charles Darwin for a model. So Darwinism was was before this, but naturalism comes from an offshoot from Charles Darwin for a model. Human beings would only survive to the extent that they could adapt to their social environments. So it started out as something positive and it ended up as something not positive. So originally, when they were talking about this, looking at, the naturalism, adaptation to one's social environment, right? And, which I think we see this all the time, just talking about moving from one job to another, one school to another, and having to make that adaptation from group to group, right? It's like, so that was just a natural way for people to watch. Oh, wow, sorry. Should have turned off my phone, I suppose. That's just a natural way for, like psychology, which was just budding at this time, really getting going, to watch human interaction, which was heavily interesting to the realists, right? Watching groups in different social groups come together and how they interacted together. Additionally, human behavior and choice could largely be defined by biochemical reactions in the body and the brain, rather than be based on a soul or higher thought process. This was their thinking. This was what they thought they had discovered at the time. So during this period, some thinkers also perverted, and I'm using that term, and if this was up and we were in classroom, I would underline it and write it on the board. Some thinkers also perverted Darwin's theories by introducing kernels of racial profiling, as you can well imagine where this was going. Kernels of racial profiling and assumptions that people of different ethnic background possessed physical and mental characteristics that gave them better advantages for adapting to different social situations. And naturally, this goes back to what we had already seen all the way coming forward, which it always ends up being the rich white guys that come up on top, right? Naturally, they are the ones that make the decisions that go, wow, I think we're the smartest at the top of the food chain, which we saw that in the chain of being, and that is how that always had happened in the past and had continued to happen here. Not thinking about backgrounds and where people had come from and who had been given different backgrounds and chances and right preparedness and all that wouldn't come until much later, and prove all of that stuff a bunch of baloney. But at the time, that's where it came from, that it started out as a positive thing where they're just watching people together and how people interact and trying to be something positive, and then ending up as something very negative in social profiling. This photograph is of Charles Darwin, 1859-ish. Yeah. Always taking a good thing and making it a bad thing. That's what happens. All right. So, I think, if I'm not mistaken, oh, nope, second to last slide. So, capturing reality, right? So, if you think about it, what's going to happen to to paint, I jumped ahead of myself, to paintings during this period. I mean, obviously I've already showed you multiple paintings because it did survive, but it took a hit initially during the realist period, because what comes about during this time, and before this time actually, but most certainly during this time, becomes prolific photography, right? This is a Degas portrait called Place de la Concorde. And it marks an important revelation during this period. So photography during this time trumps paintings, right? Because think about it. What's going to be more quote unquote real, capturing reality, a painting or a photography or a photo, right? Well, a photo can just snap an instant picture. So obviously that's going to be reality, versus a painting, which up until this time period, paintings were very were painting in an affect, right? Where they were, they were posed, they were heavily posed. People are standing there, or they were artifice, right? We talked before about how art was meant for artifice, or what was it for? To entertain, to delight, whatever. So the purpose of art before wasn't to be realistic. That wasn't art's purpose before. And they did that on purpose. So now all of a sudden you have this era of realism where people want things to be realistic, excuse me, representation of the unvarnished truth. And now suddenly paintings are like, uh-oh, how do we capture this when we have photographers running around with cameras? So they had to come up with a new way to capture this sense, right? So in painting, Degas proves that a painting can be just as realistic as a photograph. So if you look at this one, for example, it's not centered, right? It's not centered. And the figures aren't facing forward, and they're shown in profile, right? They're not paying attention. There's a dog in there. There's a guy photo bombing us over here to the side, right? Painting bombing us over here. He's like jumped in and he's in there. There's a horse over here, and they're like almost half out of their picture, and there's a dog. So the painting is created to give us this idea of a more lifelike situation at the park. And then it can also give you ideas of what it was meant for, a stroll in the park, an middle class family, maybe upper class family, and what are they doing with the little girls out of the parks, that kind of thing. So realism was reborn in painting because of all of this. So it did survive, obviously, but it took it a minute to recover. Okay, last thing we'll talk about here. Though we didn't get to venture into the Far East very much this semester, slimming down, I did want to just bring up Higuchi Ichio, a Japanese woman writer, published fiction, which by itself is its own feat at the time period. Fiction that focused on poor and marginal characters, so very in line with what's happening in the West, in Europe, and the rest of in Europe and stuff with realism. So in Japan, writing about marginal characters in the city as they struggle to make choices in difficult economic situations and an environment. So very similar, right? Poor marginalized characters, and more about city life and finance in those types of situations. She used colloquial speech and a very lively dialogue that sounded more natural, more realistic than that of more traditional characters that had up until that point been part of Japanese writing. This was a photograph of her in 1895. So despite the fact that they had often ran a different course, in the East from the West, they still had their own version of realism that was comparable. So they had the same thing going on, and for the same reasons, trying to bring this out and make people aware for the same thing. So that's kind of realism in a nutshell there, and I hope that makes sense, that it was different than what came before it, and that you'll kind of see some little bits of that, some little seeds of that as you read or reread, if you read it before you watched this, A Christmas Tree and a Wedding.